It is 11:47 at night. On a desk somewhere, maybe one you recognize, there are 3 open textbooks, 2 highlighter pens in different colors, and a cup of coffee that has gone cold. The student sitting there has been working for 7 hours. Her notes are neat. Her outlines are color-coded. She has read chapter 4 times. Tomorrow she will fail the exam. Not because she wasn't trying, not because she isn't intelligent, but because every single thing she did tonight, the highlighting, the rereading, the quiet, earnest review, was teaching her brain to feel like it was learning, while leaving almost nothing behind. This is a particular kind of exhaustion, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind where you work harder than everyone around you and still come up empty. And you have no idea why, because the effort was real. Japanese students aren't studying more. They've simply solved a problem that most of the world hasn't realized is a problem yet. And when you understand what that problem actually is, when you see the mechanism behind it, you will never sit down to study the same way again. In 2006, 2 cognitive psychologists at Washington University in St. Louis ran an experiment that should have changed how every school on earth taught its students. Henry Roediger and Roediger Karpicke gave 2 groups of students the exact same learning material, prose passages, the kind you'd find in any university textbook. One group studied the material repeatedly. They reread, they reviewed, they did everything a diligent student is taught to do. The other group did something different. They closed the material and tried to recall it, imperfectly, incompletely, with the discomfort of not being sure. They tested themselves. No feedback, no corrections, just the effort of retrieval. 5 minutes later, the rereading group scored higher. They felt more prepared, more confident. 1 week later, the data told a different story. Students who had only reread had forgotten 56% of what they originally knew. Students who had practiced retrieval had forgotten just 13%. That is not a small margin. That is a 4-fold gap in forgetting, produced not by studying longer, not by working harder, but by doing something structurally different with the same hours. Roediger and Karpicke called it the testing effect. The cognitive science community calls it one of the most replicated findings in the modern study of memory. The broken equation most students live by, more hours equals more retained, is not a minor miscalculation. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of what the human brain is actually doing when it learns. Here's what the data suggests instead, and here is where Japanese study culture, quietly and for generations, has already been living. There is a word in Japanese that translates, in most dictionaries, as simply review. But that translation misses something important. The word is Fukushū, and when you understand what it is actually built from, the entire concept shifts. The first part of the word fuku means to return, to come back, to repeat a motion not out of habit but with purpose. The second part, shu, means to practice through doing, not to observe, not to absorb passively, to engage through action. Fukushū is not review, it is returning to do something, specifically and deliberately. And that single distinction between returning to read and returning to act is the first place Japanese study culture diverges from what most students in the world have been taught. Here is what this looks like in practice. A student using passive review opens the same chapter she studied yesterday. She reads it again. It feels familiar, the words flow. She finishes feeling reasonably confident. What she doesn't realize is that familiarity and memory are 2 completely different things, and the brain is exceptionally skilled at confusing one for the other. A student practicing Fukushū closes the book first. She sits with a blank page. She asks herself, what do I actually know? What can I reconstruct right now, without help, without prompting, without the safety of the text in front of me? The process is harder. It is less comfortable. There are gaps and hesitations and the quiet embarrassment of not knowing what she thought she knew. That discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. That discomfort is the sound of a memory being built. The cognitive science explains it this way. When you reread material, you are activating recognition, a shallow, low-effort neural process. When you retrieve material, you are activating recall, a deeper, more demanding process that physically strengthens the synaptic connections involved in that memory. The effort of reaching for the information is precisely what makes the information stay. Fukushū, understood correctly, is not a study habit. It is a structural redesign of where the effort actually goes. The hours don't increase. The architecture changes. And what you carry out the other side is different in kind, not just in degree. There is a second piece of this, and it has nothing to do with what you study. It has everything to do with the quality of attention you bring into the room. In Densetsu's martial arts, there is a concept called Zanshin. It describes a state that a skilled archer or swordsman enters, not during the strike but after it, a state of complete unhurried awareness. The body relaxed, the mind entirely present, nothing held in reserve for distraction. The literal translation is something like, the mind with no remainder. That phrase is worth sitting with for a moment, the mind with no remainder. A state where attention has been entirely spent on what is in front of you. No thread of thought still pulling toward a phone, toward tomorrow, toward the sound of something happening in the next room. Here is why this matters for a student sitting at a desk. Roediger and Karpicke's study showed that retrieval practice produces dramatically better retention than rereading. But what the data also reveals, and what researchers in attention and cognitive load have documented extensively, is that fragmented attention during study doesn't just reduce how much you learn. It reduces how deep the encoding goes. The memory becomes shallow, brittle, easy to displace. Imagine two students each sitting for 2 hours. One is scrolling between her textbook and her phone. One read, one notification, one glance at a message. The other is still, one task. No remainder. The first student spent 2 hours near the material. The second student spent 2 hours inside it. The number of hours was identical. What happened inside those hours was completely different. Zanshin in study is not about discipline in the punishing sense. It is not about white-knuckling your attention into submission. Japanese martial arts describe Zanshin as relaxed alertness, a quality of ease, not strain. The master archer is not clenching. He is simply entirely here. The practical application is smaller than people expect. Remove one source of fragmentation completely before you begin, not all of them. 1. The phone in another room, notifications off, one tab open. Begin with the awareness that for this period, this bounded, deliberate window, there is only this. The mind with no remainder is not a poetic ideal. It is the neurological condition under which encoding actually works. The deepest layer of how Japanese students learn is not a technique. It is a philosophy of how knowledge moves through a person. From the outside in, from the memorized to the understood, from the to something that becomes simply part of how you think. There is a concept in Japanese martial arts and tea ceremony philosophy called Shu-Ha-Ri. It describes 3 stages of learning, not 3 steps in a lesson plan, 3 stages in a life. The concept is attributed to Senno Rikyū, the 16th century tea master who transformed the Japanese tea ceremony from a ritual into a philosophy. His formulation, passed through generations of practice, translates roughly this way: follow the rule, break the rule, transcend the rule. Let's stay with each stage long enough to understand what it actually means. The first stage, Shu, meaning to protect or to follow, is where all learning begins. This is not the passive, comfortable rereading that most students mistake for learning. Shu is faithful, effortful absorption. You receive the form exactly as it is given. You practice it without alteration, without questioning, without improvising. The goal is not yet understanding. The goal is internalization. Shu is the architecture of Fukushū. Scheduled, deliberate, retrieval-based practice, repeated until the information sits solidly in long-term memory. Most students in the modern Western system live entirely in Shu, but a corrupted version of it. They absorb passively. They mistake familiarity for mastery. They stay at the surface of the material, while believing they have gone deeper. And when the exam asks them to actually use the knowledge, to connect it, to apply it, to transfer it, the scaffold collapses. Real Shu, the kind Japanese practice demands, requires that you can reconstruct the material without the material in front of you. Nothing less counts as having completed the stage. The second stage, Ha, meaning to break or to question, is where understanding begins to deepen. You have already internalized the form. Now you test it. You ask, why does this work? What is the principle underneath it? Where does it connect to something else I already know? This is the stage where a student stops treating information as isolated facts and begins building a web. Neuroscience has a term for this, elaborative encoding. The brain encodes new information more durably when it is connected to existing memory, when it is not just a new file, but a new node in a network. The Japanese student who has truly passed through Fukushū arrives at Ha naturally. Because when you have retrieved information enough times that it lives in long-term memory, you begin to notice things about it. Patterns emerge, questions form. The material starts to feel less like a set of rules and more like a system. The third stage, Ri, meaning to separate or to transcend, is where the knowledge stops being knowledge and becomes capacity. This is difficult to explain until you have experienced it, but you have experienced versions of it. Think of a language you learned as a child. You don't remember studying it. You don't remember retrieving it. It is simply there, available, automatic, below the level of conscious effort. Or a route you have driven so many times that you arrive at the destination without being able to recall the turn you took 2 miles back. The knowledge has dissolved into ability. This is what Ri describes. The information is no longer something you access. It is something you are. The neuroscience underneath this is well documented. What begins as declarative memory, explicit, effortful, conscious retrieval, transforms through repetition and connection into procedural and semantic memory. The hippocampus, which manages conscious recall, gradually hands the information over to deeper cortical structures. Retrieval becomes faster, then automatic, then invisible. Most students never get there because they confuse the entry point, passive rereading, with the actual journey. They stay in a false version of Shu forever, comfortable, familiar, and shallow. The framework of Shu-Ha-Ri is not an inspiration, it is a map. A description of what the brain actually does when learning goes all the way through. Fukushū redesigns the session, Zanshin protects the quality of attention inside the session, and Shu-Ha-Ri describes where the knowledge is going. Not just into your notes, not just into a short-term confidence, but into the slow, permanent architecture of who you become. Tonight, not next week, tonight, there is one thing worth doing differently. Before you open a book or a set of notes, take a blank piece of paper and write down everything you already know about the topic. Not what you think you should know, what you can actually retrieve right now without help. Sit with the gaps. Don't fill them yet. Feel where the knowledge is solid and where it isn't. That process, that 10-minute act of honest retrieval before a single new page is opened, is Fukushū. It is Zanshin, because it requires you to be completely present with what you actually know rather than what you hope to know. And it is the beginning of Shu. Not reading to feel familiar, but reconstructing to find out what is real. The student at 11:47 p.m., surrounded by highlighted pages, is not failing because she is inadequate. She is failing because no one taught her that the effort of retrieval is the thing. Not the hours in the chair, not the color of the highlighter, not the number of times she has seen the same sentence. When she learns this, something shifts, the exam score changes, but so does something quieter. She stops measuring her worth by how long she sat. She starts measuring it by what she can actually carry with her when she walks out of the room. That quality, the ability to distinguish between the feeling of learning and the fact of it, is something that will serve her not just on next week's exam, but in every meeting room, every skill she tries to build, every moment she sits down to understand something that matters. The Japanese have understood this for a long time, not as a secret and not as a tradition to admire from a distance, as a practice, available, functional, beginning tonight. The strategies in this video are drawn from peer-reviewed cognitive science and reflect general educational principles, not a substitute for guidance from your teachers, academic advisors, or learning specialists who know your individual needs. If someone in your life is working hard and getting less than they deserve from it, let this reach them. The distance between 8 empty hours and 2 real ones is not talent, it is architecture.